Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka, host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Let's start. Good evening, everybody who is in Japan, or good morning or good day to you if you're in other parts of the world. Thank you for joining the Geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific room with Professor Stephen Nagy and me, Maya Matsuoka. We appreciate your presence. We appreciate also your comments, which you can write in the room chat, or you can join us on stage later. So today we're going to talk about what we can expect from the meeting this week's meeting between Joe Biden, the US President, Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida. Quite a few things. I believe there are different perspectives which we can talk about as well. But without any further ado, I will give the floor to Stephen so that after that we can actually discuss the topic and hear from you as well. Stephen, the floor is yours.
So thanks very much, Maya, and thanks very much to everybody that's in the room today. And there's some really interesting meetings going on this week in Washington, and it's not just with Prime Minister Kishida visiting Washington. It's also Prime Minister Trudeau and the Mexican president also having meetings in Washington with Mr. Biden. And this is important because what we see is, of course, prior to Prime Minister Kishida visiting is that Trudeau, Biden, and the Mexican counterpart have really talked about economy, trade, supply chains, and security. And these are really, really important themes right now when we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific. We're thinking about it in terms of selective diversification of certain supply chains away from China. We're talking about reshoring and friendshoring of particular supply chains, in particular semiconductors. We're talking about this idea of a foreign policy for the middle class, which is something that Mr. Biden has rebranded, but he is attempting to weave and create a link between the so-called foreign policy for the middle class and, this Indo-Pacific strategy that he has put forward, which really aims at competing and cooperating and, of course, pushing back against China within the region, but ensuring that the broader region continues to develop through and based on a common set of rules that most countries within the region agree upon. So I think that is a really important aspect to be talking about in terms of how Prime Minister Kishida will be coming into Washington and how he will link his Indo-Pacific agenda to the Biden administration's broader agenda. Now, next year in March, the Japanese will host the G7, and it will be hosted in Hiroshima. Hiroshima is the hometown of Prime Minister Kishida, and he continues to be very proud of where he comes from and Hiroshima's history in terms of being the first city that was bombed by a nuclear weapon. We see him being very much wedded to that non-nuclear approach, and we saw this back in June at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where Prime Minister Kishida, in his Kishida Vision for Peace, basically explicitly said that Japan, at least under his leadership, will never possess nuclear weapons, never produce nuclear weapons, and never allow nuclear weapons to be transited through its territories. And what we've seen is this theme be repeated, and it's been repeated, and we call this the three no's. And it was repeated most recently in the new national security strategy, which also made an effort to highlight that Japan will remain wedded to its pacifist constitution, to a strictly defensive-oriented security posture, and that it will continue to abide by these three non-nuclear principles. And why that's important for the G7 and for Mr. Kishida visiting next week is that he's going to be talking to some key members. He's going to be talking to, of course, President Biden. He's going to talk to Prime Minister Trudeau and other members of the G7 during his visits to Europe. And this will be some of the highlights of that Prime Minister Kishida, in talking about his vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific vision, really will continue to focus on this idea of a rules-based order, one that is free of coercion, one that is focusing on peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits, one that is linking Russia's invasion of Ukraine and this idea of preventing a country or countries within this region using force to change the status quo. And he's also going to highlight the importance of denuclearization within the region and globally. And this will be a major theme of the discussions over the next week, but of course the G7 summit that will take place in March. Other important discussions, I think, moving forward as Kishida visits Washington in particular, will likely be discussions about the new national security strategy and what does it mean for Japan-U.S. partnership within the region, and really trying to push forward on cementing this idea of a rules-based, free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And here, I think that the United States will welcome Japan's commitment to spending 2% of its GDP in 5 years on its new defense budget. It will welcome the acquisition of counter-strike capabilities, and it will welcome the enhanced security role that Japan will face is committing to itself in the region. And here, I think that both Biden and the Kishida administration will be talking quite a bit about the synergies in their national security strategies, their concerns for the region. And those concerns are growing, and it's not just the concerns about cross-strait relations in terms of Taiwan-China relations, concerns about the direction of North Korea and its production of a plethora of different kinds of missile systems that can be launched into the region to saturate the anti-ballistic missile systems within the region. So I think that these will also be important areas of discussion for Kishida and Biden, but also as Kishida visits Canada for his first visit to Canada and to meet Prime Minister Trudeau to talk about their overlapping priorities for their Indo-Pacific strategies as well. So there's a lot on the table for Prime Minister Kishida, but this week will be an important platform for him to talk about Japan's leadership within the region, Japan's commitment to diplomacy, to security, to economics, to resilient supply chains within the region. And he'll be talking, again, a lot about how the G7 has to work together, and that the G7 meeting in March will be an important platform for creating more synergy and cooperation between the G7 to deal with challenges within the Indo-Pacific, but broadly the challenges that are facing the global economy as well as the global security environment. And here, I think a useful tool for anybody that's listening on the call is to take a look at the Eurasia Group's 2023 top 10 risks. And at the top is, of course, Mr. Putin, and number 2 is Xi Jinping. And basically, the Eurasia Group feels that these two countries have isolated leaders that potentially are making decisions not based on all the data, and they could potentially create huge challenges for the region. While the Eurasia Group is just a private corporation, I think that its conclusions about the challenges of a weaker Putin moving forward, a disruptor within the region, and a China moving forward under Xi Jinping that is less confident, will create challenges for countries like Japan and the United States, but also South Korea, Canada, Australia, in the Indo-Pacific region. And these will be largely on the menu of discussion points for Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Washington. So I think that is some important take-homes. I'd also like to add there's some interesting news out of South Korea with their own release of an Indo-Pacific strategy. And why I think this is important, because the language used by the Yoon administration resonates very much with the Indo-Pacific strategies out of Germany, Canada, Japan, in terms of talking about a free, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. Also the focus on inclusiveness, trust, and reciprocity. And I think that these are really, really, they overlap with the Japanese, and it provides some possible discussions for deepening trilateral cooperations between Japan, South Korea, and the United States within the region. In particular, the South Koreans really highlighted in their vision that they are a democratic state, and that they value international norms, and they want to encourage strengthening the current rules-based order that's based on freedom, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. These will be key themes, I think, of Japan's efforts at the G7, and key themes that will be discussed in Washington this week between Biden and Kishida. We see that the Koreans have also talked about active efforts to prevent disputes and armed conflicts based on rules. Again, these are key themes that overlap with the Japanese and the Americans that I think are really, really important. They also talk about resilience and stability and prosperity, so focusing on trade and building resilience within the region. Again, key themes that I think the Biden administration and the Kishida administration will be talking about this week. So there's a lot of interesting news in the Indo-Pacific, and I don't think it's just with regards to the Kishida Biden visit, but also a convergence of interests and strategies that will reinforce, I think, much of how Japan is thinking about the region, but also those synergies between the United States and Japan. So maybe I'll leave it there. And I see that Mark and Nakanishi-san or Hiroaki have many questions, but I'd like to hear from all of you.
Thank you, Stephen, for that. Right, I will invite, Mark and Hiroaki, also Lynn on stage. Hopefully other people who are also in the room will join us, because this is an open discussion. So please feel free to talk with us, share your opinions and points of view. And Lynn, good evening to you. How are you today?
Yes, hi Maya. Happy New Year. Good evening, Professor Stephen. Yeah.
Hi Lynn, Happy New Year to you.
Actually, I also already prepared a couple of questions before our talk today. So I think that I will ask one by one first. So my first question relates to Japan-UK reciprocal access agreement. So as far as I know that the two countries is going to sign a similar defense pact like Japan had with Australia. So actually, I do not know much about this. So Professor Stephen, can you help me share more about this? It is basically mirror the defense pact with between Japan and Australia. I mean, in terms of the level of commitment and the scope of cooperation. Thank you.
So I think that it's probably wrong to characterize the British or the UK-Japan reciprocal access agreement as a defense pact. I think when we think about a defense pact, what comes to mind is an alliance and a commitment to defend each other in a conflict. And I think if you look at the details of these reciprocal access agreements, that the name in itself tells you everything that what they are aspiring for, so that the British and the Japanese can access each other's defense-related areas, that they can train together, they can station and leave goods or security-related items in each other's territories. We're likely to see more joint training, but a commitment to fight on behalf of each other. Japan only has one alliance, and that's the United States. So I wouldn't call this a defense pact. Again, and I think you should think about it in terms of enhancing security cooperation, but definitely below the level of an alliance, where there is a firm commitment to come to the aid of each other. That being said, the reciprocal access agreement, whether it's the Australians and the Japanese or the UK and the Japanese, will increase the shared norms and shared views about many issues between these two countries. They'll build more interoperability because they'll be training with each other and get more familiar with each other and each other's security and defense protocols. And of course, this can create synergies in how they manage challenges within the region. So I think that is probably a more accurate way to depict depict these kinds of reciprocal access agreements rather than a defense treaty.
Yes, thank you, Professor. So may I ask the follow-up question relating to this? Because if I know correctly, the Philippines will be the next country that Japan is going to sign RIA with. So what exactly, what Japan looking for in other countries to sign that kind of agreement? I mean, why it is Australia, why it is the UK, and why it is the Philippines, not other countries first?
So my sense in terms of understanding why different countries are being asked to sign reciprocal access agreements, one probably has to do with their level of development, economic size, shared values. Two, probably their geographic, where they are geographically within the region and how this may impact Japan. And three, the long-standing relationships between the two countries. So the first one, I think it's pretty easy to think that Australia and the UK share a lot of similar views on challenges within the region, and as a result, at that level, I think that it's a natural fit. Second is the geography. So the UK is obviously not geographically within the region, making it less suitable, but it has a lot of assets within the region, a lot of experience within the region. And in this sense, I think that it comes off as, not a bad partner to establish those relationships. I should say that the UK also has very strong relationships with the United States, as does Australia. So these are interlocking pieces of a bigger puzzle. Lastly, I think, geography-wise, the Philippines is a really critical area in terms of its geographic position within the South China Sea. And I think that there's growing understanding that, a political entity like Taiwan, it may be able to defend itself against, a country that would like to invade it, or a country that would like to forcefully unify with it. And it will be able to a certain extent, defend itself. But the Philippines is not in that position. And I think that there's growing awareness that the Philippines may be the weak link in the kind of the broader security architecture within the region, and that it's important for countries like Japan and the United States, Australia, to start investing in the Philippines so that it can have a more robust security role within the region. Now, why Japan thinking about the Philippines? Geographically, yes, but they also have a really good relationship with the Philippines, making it much easier to build the relationship and to build the reciprocal access agreement moving forward. History is not an issue like it is, for example, with China and South Korea, and as a result, it's much easier to move in and create these relationships. I think that, again, Japan sees the Philippines as really an important partner dealing with much of the South China Sea issues. And we saw that actually when President Duterte was elected, and he didn't enforce the decision of the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration, and he tilted towards China. And I think that for Japan, their response to that was to immediately engage with the Philippines and try to strengthen bilateral relations and communicate with the Philippines on behalf of many countries, including the United States, to keep it in the orbit of, I guess, the so-called Western countries. So there's a lot there, but I think that gives you a bit of an understanding of the why the Philippines is a good candidate for a reciprocal access agreement.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
You're
So
welcome.
I have another question relating to Ukraine, because you know that Japan is the only G7 country whose leader has not met the Ukrainian president in person. So when getting the invitation from the Ukraine president, Kishida was reluctant to give the decision and said that he need to consider visiting as take into account various circumstances. And I think that Japan is one of the countries that strongly condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it also imposed heavy sanctions against Russia. So what are the possible reasons that behind Kishida hesitancies to visit Ukraine?
Well, I think that one of the hesitancies has to do with the fact that Japan is still getting oil from the Sakhalin Islands and energy resources. And I think that there is some concern in Kasumi-Gaseki that Russia may retaliate by cutting off those resources. Japan continues to try and put a thread through a needlehead, criticizing Russia, but at the same time not completely destroying the relationship so that it can get those needed energy resources within the region. My view is that I think that the Japanese public would be quite supportive of seeing Prime Minister Kishida speak with Zelensky. I think that they would see it as demonstrating Japan's commitment to defending an open and sovereign state. And I think that for the ordinary Japanese, that they would find this to be something that is something that the Japanese government, a Japanese leader could do. However, Mr. Kishida is in a precarious place in terms of his domestic politics right now, and the optics of him visiting the Ukraine and Zelensky could be used by opponents to, further destabilize his government as well.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn. We have several questions in the chat, and I also have some questions to you. Okay, so I'll go through the questions in the chat first. One of them, the first one is from Mark. Mark cannot join us on stage. He cannot speak now, but the question from him is, and also it's a question comment. It's about the free and open Indo-Pacific, and in which areas can Japan improve the cooperation in the free and open Indo-Pacific. So Tokyo announced that their foreign aid will include military aid to friendly countries, which is a big leap since former Prime Minister ended the strict arms restrictions years ago.
I think that Japan's role with regards to cooperating in the Indo-Pacific can be many things. For example, spearheading infrastructure connectivity within the Indo-Pacific, search and rescue missions, anti-piracy missions, non-traditional security issues such as transnational disease management. Japan has a huge role in terms of coordinating partnerships in Southeast Asia because it does have long-standing positive partnerships with many countries in that region. In terms of trade and economy, well, I think Japan's already doing this. It signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It could be a strong advocate for bringing in new countries. Here I'm thinking about Sri Lanka, maybe the Maldives, maybe Nepal, maybe even Pakistan. So expanding the number of partners within the region. I think that Japan has, of course, in terms of trade, thinking about the expansion of the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And here I think that Japan is already working with countries like South Korea and the UK to try and bring them into the TPP-11. We could see Japan working with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to bring in other countries or political entities such as Taiwan. I didn't mention China into it because I think that China can't meet the standards yet. But in the future, they may be able to meet the standards of the TPP, depending on the domestic reforms that they take place. In terms of diplomacy, here I think that Japan has some really interesting possibilities. So they could spearhead denuclearization talks within the region, and they don't need to just work with South Korea, but they could bring in Canadians, Australians, Europeans, and other states are interested in denuclearization. I know Hiroaki is interested in intermediate missile systems. I do think that Japan's not on the same book in terms of getting rid of these intermediate missile systems. They're actually actively seeking counter-strike capabilities because they feel that this is the best way to secure their territories. But I do think that diplomacy is another area. Again, denuclearization, maybe working with countries like Canada against arbitrary detention of citizens, which I think is really important. We could think about Japan working on inclusive development within the region. I think there's a lot of different areas. Lastly, and I think what many people think about is security. Where does Japan sit in terms of security cooperation within the region? Well, here I think that there's limits. Japan continues to wed its security to the U.S.-Japan alliance. That is its cornerstone. That's not going to change. But we do see an expansion of Japan's security activities through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, through working in trilateral and multilateral forums like the RIMPAC exercises, in which Japan works with many countries. And even the fleet review this summer, or this fall, I think is an important marker of how Japan is a welcome and good international citizen, where most countries view Japan as not as a militarizing state or a state that has aggressive tendencies, but as a state that is bound to international rules. So I do think there's a lot of different areas, Hiroaki, where Japan can strengthen its cooperation with the Indo-Pacific, and it means working in different formulas with different countries that have different capabilities. Another, I think, interesting place is look at the Pacific Islands. I think that the Pacific Islands are a really interesting area because Japan could work with the French and the New Zealanders, the Australians, the Canadians, and the Americans that all have significant stakes within the Pacific Islands. And that engagement could be, again, working on development, environmental issues, fishery management, a lot of different issues. And that will depend on what the Japanese would like to invest their resources in, but also what those countries are interested in receiving.
Right. Thank you for that. Oh, yes. Oh, Mehran, you can hear us now?
Yes. It was very beautiful talk listening to Professor Nagy. I just had one comment that I think Japan potentially, looking at the size of China and its strength and history, needs to counter China. And I heard something Professor mentioned about South Korea, and South Koreans have all been very careful not to get involved too much because of North Korean issue and the conflict they have. And I would appreciate if he post the reference up and talk about it more, because at that time I didn't hear completely what he said. So I would be interested in what change in policy he saw in South Korea to get closer to Japanese alliance in the region. And I agree with him that right now Japan is too busy for a potential future with China to annoy Russians today, so they're being careful about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moran. So I would agree that, first I'll say I think Japan is very interested in preventing Chinese hegemony from emerging. I think this is in the interest of every single country within the region. The question is how can they prevent Chinese hegemony from emerging, but also benefit from the Chinese economy and the Chinese development? And this is something that all the countries within the region are looking at. They want to maintain their strategic autonomy. They don't want to see, a very, very powerful China emerge that they have to agree with on every single issue. But at the same time, they want to engage. So I think that they're very cautious about how they're engaging with China with that mindset in mind. But it also leads to the point about Russia. And, the priority for Japan really over the long term is China. Russia is, of course, an important energy provider. But the threat that Russia provides or is towards Japan is completely different than what the national security strategy addresses as the greatest challenge for Japan within the region. So I think you understand my comments correctly. With regards to the South Koreans, you can just take a look at this. The South Koreans have released their own Indo-Pacific strategy document. So if you're interested in reading that, you can just Google it. It's called Strategy for a Free, Peaceful, and Prosperous Indo-Pacific Region. And what's interesting about it is a continuation of a commitment to working with South Koreans' key partner for engagement within the region will be the United States through the U.S. ROK alliance. It doesn't label China as a threat, but it talks a lot about threats to a rules-based order, that problems about coercion, problems about states not following international law, which is kind of code for criticizing China. But it also talks about working with the United States and Japan and other like-minded countries in terms of dealing with many challenges that exist within the region. And in this sense, I think that the Yoon administration is particularly pragmatic, and they look at Japan not through the lens of an aggressor state, or a state that is aggressive, but as a state that's a potential partner. And we've seen that since the Yoon administration was campaigning to become president, but prior to becoming president, he made statements about the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement deal being official policy. He's reached out to the Japanese at many, many different levels and talked about trilateral cooperation. And this document that I mentioned, you can read it. Talks about South Korea working with other partners. And I think this will continue to be themes under the conservative Yoon government and in future conservative Yoon governments or conservative governments, as their view on North Korea is rather pessimistic. They have a very realistic view about the direction of China and the challenges that it'll face for South Korea. And as a result, they are tilting towards strengthening the U.S.-South Korean relationship, but also trying to bring the relationship between South Korea and Japan back to a much more functional and less inflammatory state.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I just Googled it and I found the document. I will certainly read it. Now,
Yeah,
if
check
I
it out.
take, sure, go back to Taiwan. You also mentioned Taiwan. I have been saying that it's probably in Japanese national interest to challenge China over Taiwan Strait, and actually they have to challenge it over any Japanese territory. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess it depends how you define challenge. I think that since for the past 3 years, Japan's been very explicit using terms like in bilateral and multilateral documents such as G7, NATO documents, bilateral statements between the United States and Japan, that peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is the priority from the Japanese point of view, and that there's no deviation from Japan's One China policy. And you probably heard me say Japan's One China policy, and I think it's always important to distinguish between what other countries' One China policies are and what China's One China principle is. And these are often conflated by the Chinese, but Japan does recognize that there's one China, or it acknowledges the one China policy, but it doesn't necessarily agree with it. And it's continued to engage in its bilateral relations with Taiwan on that basis. Should it be more proactive in defending Taiwan? My view is it needs to thread the needle very carefully in terms of sending all the right messages to Taiwan that it will not support unilateral declaration of independence, but to Beijing at the same time it has to send a signal that it will not accept forced reunification. How can Japan do that? Well, I think that means strengthening and investing in all aspects of Taiwanese democratic society and civil society. And that means increasing the number of university exchanges, school exchanges, city-to-city exchanges, fishery association exchanges, create as many layers to the relationship as possible so that what happens to Taiwan matters. I think that Japan needs to coordinate its actions with the United States and Australia and other countries in terms of providing more deterrence capabilities for the Taiwanese themselves, but also draw out contingency plans to manage the certain negative repercussions if there was a forced reunification on supply chains and trade and technology. I think that the new national security strategy, which talks about counterstrike capabilities, really, I don't think has Taiwan front and center in its thoughts, but I do think it does think about the Taiwanese situation. I just broadly, I think that, again, as Japan thinks about Taiwan and its security calculus, that it needs to proceed cautiously in terms of not calling Taiwan a state or acknowledging it as a state, but at the same time it needs to strengthen all of those deterrence capabilities and weave it into as many multilateral relationships as possible, so that what happens to Taiwan matters for not just Japan but other countries as well. And I think at that point it may create more disincentives for China to engage in forced reunification than not.
Yes, thank you. I agree with you. I think the issue is CCP. Otherwise, if China becomes democratic, more like Taiwan, even Taiwanese wouldn't mind joining a united China. The issue is just not having democracy. And what I meant was, as it looks like U.S. policy is moving away from being ambiguous about defending Taiwan, I think probably parallel to that, Japanese would gradually move towards being clear whether they would defend Taiwan in case of a forceful action.
Well, at this stage, I don't think the Japanese are there. I think they're far away from any kind of explicit statement about Taiwan. Their preference is not to even consider defending Taiwan, and that's why they choose very specific statements in their public statements. I actually don't know if democratic mainland China would make a difference in terms of how Japan is seeing Taiwan. And the reason why I say that is I think that, there's many kinds of democracies, and if the democratic China sees security in the same way that the current Chinese Communist Party sees security, then they would look at Taiwan exactly the same as they are now, and this would create the same kinds of challenges for Japan. So I think this is less a democracy or not for us, and more about Taiwan's position in supply chains, in particular semiconductor supply chains, but also in its position in the first island chain in terms of security perimeter that encircles China. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about and being overly optimistic that China will one day become like Taiwan in terms of its democratic governance. But, many people said that about South Korea 40 years ago, and Taiwan 40 years ago, and even Japan 80 years ago. So we should always have hope.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your smart questions.
Yes, I was listening to you and thinking that some countries have realized the need to actually get semiconductor industries on their territories and not rely only, on what Taiwan produces. So we can see that trend in the European Union, also Japan and the United States. I believe that some other countries have realized that need as well. So do you think that in the middle to, let's say, a long term, when those countries become less dependent on the production of semiconductors in Taiwan, that they might change or they may change their stance towards towards Taiwan and China?
No, I actually think that corporate Japan, United States, Canada, Bulgaria, France, UK is captured by the Chinese market, and that their priority is clearly profits, and that until there is an alternative consumer center and production center, that the decision on Taiwan will remain ambiguous, silent, at best. And they understand very clearly that if they take a public view on Taiwan that goes against the current government in China, that they will be locked out of the Chinese market and locked out of 400 or 500 million middle-class consumers. And I hear this over and over from different business communities that they do not want to leave the Chinese market, and they do not want to say goodbye to the Chinese consumer. If you're interested in this kind of, how trapped are corporate interests in different countries, there's a great book called America's Second by Isaac Stonefish, and I think it's a great read in terms of just getting a better sense of how much our interests are captured by the Chinese market and how it affects the decisions of corporations about their investments and their decisions and choices about recognizing Taiwan as a state, investing in Taiwan, or even keeping Taiwan on a map in their office. It's very severe and quite interesting.
Right. So that is the book is available, I believe, on Amazon and other. Probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a really easy read, and it's a bit startling, to be quite frank.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Thank you for that. And I also just want to say that Mark, he shared a link to one of his articles, I believe, about the Philippines. So the Philippines mows a visiting forces agreement with Japan. So if you're interested, to everybody in the audience, please click on the link and have a look at have a read. Also, I have another question to you, Stephen. It is about. We are talking mostly about security and mostly about the defense budget in Japan and militarization in the region. But of course, it's also about economic security. The meeting between Joe Biden and Fumio Kishida coming when? It's this Wednesday?
Yeah.
Or maybe Thursday. Yes. But okay, Well, I believe that there are different perspectives here in the region because there are so many countries. And how do you think the meeting will resonate with different governments here in the region? And when I say different governments, you already talked about South Korea. We also touched upon China and so on. But how about the other governments in Southeast Asia, for example, and the Pacific Islands as well?
Well, frankly, it's for the countries in Southeast Asia, by and large, they don't see Japan as a troublesome actor. Far from. They want more Japan in the region, and they would like more U.S.-Japan partnership, and they would like Japan to influence the United States in a more positive way. And what I mean by a more positive way is to get the United States investing diplomatic, economic, trade resources within the region, helping build infrastructure and connectivity, again, bolstering their diplomatic presence within the region, and also anchoring the U.S. in the region through a trade agreement, whether it's the TPP or otherwise. Southeast Asian countries would like Japan to have a bigger role in making that happen. You don't hear concerns about, Japan as a. I mean, the usual suspects that are always anti-Japan and talking about Japan in terms of remilitarizing and never apologizing for its World War II actions. These voices will always be there, and I think a large percentage are either trolls or just not curious enough to actually see what's been done. But most of Southeast Asian countries view Japan as an outstanding actor within the region and the most trusted within the region. So I think that they are looking for, again, Japan to help moderate the United States and to help communicate to the United States what Southeast Asian countries want. South Korea is interesting because I think the conservatives feel similar to what I just said, but the progressives in the South Korean context have a different view. The progressives are still feels Japan has not atoned for its colonial period, and this, I think, is something that is now embedded in the political calculus in the progressives in South Korea, and I don't think there's any space to actually change that. North Korea will basically say that Japan is a lapdog of the United States. China will echo this, talking about how Japan and the United States are trying to contain Japan. But these views are, by and large, the minority in looking at the visit of Kishida to Washington to meet President Biden. And I think that's something that the media doesn't really want to report on. Even, I was in the South China Post this morning on an article about Sino-Japanese relations, and the article's title was specifically Japan is militarizing. And when I was speaking to the reporter, I said, Japan's not militarizing, right? In 2021, China's known military budget was $223 billion, a 77% increase from the year before. Japan's is $54 billion, and it's going to double in 5 years. Where will the Chinese budget be in 5 years? It'll still be, triple or quadruple what the Japanese budget is. So I think really you need to, when we think about this and think about different countries think about it, I'm not sure how much we can change the tone in capitals like Seoul and North Korea and China, but I think Southeast Asian countries, Europe, Australia, they see the partnership as really, really important for stability in the region.
Yes, indeed. Well, just my question came because we always talk about the great number of countries in this region. So, and of course, we also know that, as Lynn has mentioned before, that some of those countries, they don't want to choose between the United States and China. So they want to have good relations with both.
Yeah, they say that in public, right? They say that in public, but in private they say, "Shit, we're sorry. Can I say shit on Clubhouse? I just did."
You just did.
So,
yes. Okay.
Yeah, they say, they say, listen, you know what? There's a problem. China's trying to expand its power within the region at our expense. We want more of the United States within the region. We want a bigger Japanese presence within the region. We want a much more proactive Japan to help deal with the security challenges and the economic hegemony that's associated with China. And I hear this over and over. Of course, it's not public, but you hear this over and over, and they're happy to see more investments by Japan and the United States, more Quad activity, because they have a clear sense of concern about Chinese behavior within the region. And you hear it over and over, and in surveys that are anonymous, you see it over and over, whether it's the Southeast Asian survey or the recent ASEAN-China survey. They're all saying the same thing. And then, like I said, in private, the views are very clear.
Professor, can I share my view?
You can even see the S word, Lynn.
Yes, so actually I also have quite similar question with Maya, because I think that if we look back in 2013 when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came back to his office, I think for not just within 1 year, he chose Southeast Asian country as his first overseas trip, not the US. So I understand that this year Japan chairs the G7 summit. So it makes sense that that Kishida make a week-long trip to G7 countries. But you know that Japan, though, has been considered as trusted partner of Southeast Asian countries for many consecutive years. However, the positive image of Japan has also been significantly affected due to COVID-19 because of the insignificant, unfrequent visits to the region. So personally, I do not know how Southeast Asian countries think about what Japan is moving. Quite defense transformation to me. But just recently, you know that China has reopened its border, and unlike the U.S. and Japan and many other nations, Southeast Asian countries are choosing to impose no new restriction, and actually they are excited to welcome back Chinese tourists. So to some extent that I do not know, for example, this year, what could be the highlight in Japan's foreign policies on Southeast Asian countries, how it will do to gain or strengthen its positive image or influence in the region.
So, Lynn, I fully agree with you that I think Japan went silent during the pandemic. They lost the opportunity to travel abroad and invest deeply into the region and provide the aid that I think Southeast Asian countries would have appreciated. And this is a loss of momentum considering how well Japan was regarded during the Abe administration. I think you're correct that Southeast Asian countries are very happy that China's opened up their borders. It will be a huge injection to a badly hit economy because of the closure because of COVID, and that this again shows the strength of the Chinese economy as a very attractive pillar for the region. And, money talks, and, Southeast Asian countries have a huge informal economy, and tourists from all around the world are an important part of helping many, many, many millions of people make ends meet. And I think that it's important for us to be thinking about the positive impact that China's reemergence will have on the regional economies, and how this will create challenges for Japan and other countries in terms of their regional diplomacy if they can't offer something similar. I don't think they have to just do tourist dollars. And this Wednesday, if you have time, on Channel News Asia, there's a documentary coming out at 9 o'clock Singapore time, and it's called Japan's Indo-Pacific Plan. And you can watch the documentary, and it talks about Japan's engagement in Southeast Asia. I'll be speaking in it as well. So you can, hopefully, you can have a look, and we might be able to talk about it on the next podcast.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Lynn. Stephen, I think that you partially answered one of Hiroaki's question, but I'll read it out to you just in case. So it's about what kind of role Japan should actively play in the Indo-Pacific dynamics.
So Hiroaki, I'm a strong believer in Japan having a leadership role And sometimes that leadership role is a direct role in terms of, for example, advocating for trade, advocating for different kinds of digital agreements. It could be for working in environmental cooperation. I think Japan has a really big role in those particular areas. But I think leadership also comes from working with other countries and coordinating and finding opportunities to shape the behavior of the United States so it understands and it can be a more effective player within the region. And that could be working with Australia and Canada and France and Japan to try to move the United States so it focuses, for example, on the Pacific, or that it understands Southeast Asia's priorities, or that it understands the importance of trade within the region. Japan is the closest partner within the region, most trusted partner within the region, but also in many ways the most knowledgeable partner within the region about the country's heterogeneity. And here I think that Japan's leadership role could be about working effectively to lobby or educate and shape some of the United States and other countries' behavior and how they engage in the Indo-Pacific broadly. The late Prime Minister Abe did this. Prior to Mr. Trump becoming elected, the United States didn't have an Indo-Pacific strategy. It was Japan and Mr. Abe showing up at the White House and saying, "This is what we're doing. You might want to think about it." And what happened is that the Trump administration took the Indo-Pacific vision that Japan offered and turned it into a strategy, and transformed it into something that they felt would be useful for Japan and useful for the United States engaging within the region. So that's another kind of leadership. It's not necessarily about holding the flag up in the front of the fight, but it could be about supporting as well.
Well, thank you, Hiroaki. I hope that this answered your question. So it is almost 9 o'clock, Stephen. So it's almost time when we need to actually close the room. So if you have a few words in closing, please go ahead.
So just thanks very much for really the deep engagement by Lynn and Mark, Miran, and others, Hiroaki. It's really great to have these questions, and all questions are good, all engagement is good, and I think the more dialogue that we can have, the better. So I look forward to future discussions with you, and do watch the CNA documentary this Wednesday at 9 o'clock Singapore time, 10 o'clock in Japan. It's going to be really interesting, all about how Japan's engaging in Southeast Asia.
Thank you. And again, from me, thank you very much for the engagement, Miran and Lynn and Hiroaki, Mark as well, also Kate Chang. We appreciate that. We'll be here once again in 2 weeks. That is January the 23rd. We'll be talking about the events happening at that time. With this, I wish you good night or good day, depending on where you are, and we're looking forward to having you again in 2 weeks at 8 o'clock. That's Monday, 8 o'clock p.m. Japan time. Stay well, take care, and see you then. Bye. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.